Well, it's exciting to be able to start this series with everybody. We're going to be spending the next 12 presentations together, exploring a topic and a series of topics centered around what we're calling the cosmic conflict. Virtually everybody on earth is engaged in what we call a spiritual battle. And this battle takes its place in various dimensions. We see things in competing thoughts of truth and error, and life and death, and evil and good. But for many of us, myself included, this idea that somehow there's a spiritual realm and there's a God and there's perhaps devils and all this sort of stuff is a bit foreign. Until the age of 23, I didn't believe any of this stuff. And so what I'll be sharing with you in these next 12 presentations is not just a part of my journey to understanding these things, but to help you see that there really is some serious challenges facing our world. But behind all of it, as I hope you will see, there is an amazing sense of hope. But before we can even start this journey, we have to ask ourselves a question. Is this book, the Bible, is it really something that we should spend our time and energy studying? As I said before, till the age of 23, I was spending my time just working a regular job in the corporate space in IT. Didn't have a second thought for God or anything to that effect. But there's something about this book that has shaped and changed the course of my life. And I hope that you'll appreciate that as we look at today's presentation. Our first part is called The Divided Empire. We're going to explore, can this book actually be trusted? Now, I know for many of you, you're already Christian and you already believe in this book. But this book is unique in the place of history because of the claims it makes. Let me share with you one of those claims. It says that all Scripture, that's the Bible in its entirety here, it claims that all this book is inspired by God. Now, you may or may not believe that, but that's the claim the Bible makes. Remarkable claim, because if you take all the books in history and pile them up in a category of books that claim to have its author as God and those that don't, there are very few books that make that claim. In fact, there are only 3. In all the books ever written in human history, only 3 claim to have come from God. That's pretty remarkable, isn't it? I thought it was. I could write a book and claim that it came from God, but no one else has attempted to do that except for 3 books, and the Bible is one of them. But this claim in and of itself doesn't guarantee that it's from God, does it? I mean, I could write a book, say it's from God, put it in some cave somewhere, and in a couple of 100 years somebody finds it and goes, wow, this was from God. That doesn't prove that it came from God, does it? So how can we be sure that we ought to take this book seriously? How can we be sure? Well, the Bible actually does something pretty remarkable. It says this. In the Old Testament book of Isaiah, God is claiming these words. He says, remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is what? None other. God is claiming that there is no other God but Him. So this book here, the one that we're going to be exploring for the next 12 presentations, it claims to have come from not just a God, but the only God. That's a bold claim. But it goes on and says, and I am God, and there is none like me. Again, that's the claim, but how do we know that is true? And in the very next verse, this is what it says. God is speaking again according to the passage, declaring the what? The end from the beginning. And from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand. This book is making not only the claim that it is from God, but it's saying this is how you will know it's from God. It's going to reveal to us future events before it takes place, and when it comes past exactly the way it was predicted, that's how you'll know that this comes from who? The only God. Does that make sense? So this book is going to try and convince us through a series of tests of prophecy that it is in fact from not just a God, not just one of the multiple gods, but from the only God. Now, when I was exploring this at 23 years of age, I was like, man, this is going to be fun. Because how can you possibly believe that this printed page is written by God? How can it have come from God? So in this presentation this morning, we're going to explore this concept. How do we know whether or not this book is worth our time? Because if this is the Word of God, we should probably pay attention, shouldn't we? If there really is a God and this is His book, we should pay attention. But if this is not really from God and it's just a book, then why waste your time with it? You may enjoy it, but it's not beneficial because it's not really from who it says it comes from. So in this presentation, we're going to explore one of the most remarkable prophecies in the book to help us establish whether or not this book actually does come from God. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to ask you 3 questions. So be ready for that. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. I'm not going to assume that you're going to be convinced at the end of this presentation that, oh yes, definitely this book is from God. But I hope that at the end of this presentation, you'll go, wow, I would like to know more. Does that sound fair? All right. So the test. I'm going to take you on a history lesson. Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo was a French poet, obviously from France. And in 1849, he was asked to come to a peace congress in Paris. And at that congress, he gave a speech. And these are the words he spoke. He said, "A day will come when all the nations of our continent will form a European brotherhood. A day will come when we shall see the United States of America and the United States of Europe face to face, reaching out for each other across the seas." This French poet, in 1849, he predicted a day when Europe would become a United States of Europe. Now, I know none of you were around in 1849, were you? I wasn't. But there was no united Europe in 1849, was there? There were independent, individual sovereign states. Today, we've actually seen almost the fulfillment of these words. Would you agree? We call it a European Union. The same way there's a union of states in the United States, there's a union of states in Europe. But the big question today is, will Europe remain united or will it divide? You've all heard of Brexit. And you know the issues that are challenging with that vote that took place in 2016. So the question that people are asking today is, what will happen with Europe? Will it stay united or will it divide? We're going to do a quick rewind of history and explore Europe based on this prophecy, but prediction of that poet. Jean Monnet was born in 1888 in France. And he had an exceptional mind for economics and for politics. And by the age of 16, he left his studies and he went to London to work for a family friend in commerce and international trade. And he very quickly became a renowned expert on these fields. In 1914, World War I broke out. And Monnet, who was in London at the time, he was convinced the only way to win World War I for the Allies was if the French and the English formed an economic union. If they didn't form one, they would be fighting with their own resources from France and their own resources from England, and it would not have the united front that would be possible if they came together. So Monnet went to the French premier and convinced him to approach the English to form this alliance for the purpose of defeating the Germans. Today, many historians believe that it was Jean Monnet's visionary perspective on this financial arrangement that actually helped win the war. And so in 1919, they held a peace conference, again in Paris, and they invited Jean Monnet to come and speak there. When he came, he gave this very interesting talk around this term called, and some of you may have heard it, he said that Europe needs an economic new world order. This is what he said in 1919. Well, his speech was a resounding success, and as a result of that, they invited him to become Deputy General Secretary of the League of Nations, which was formed after World War I in Europe. The League of Nations, of course, became what? The United Nations. So Jean Monnet held an extremely key position in the transfer from World War I into this League of Nations into the United Nations. However, as you know your history, shortly after, just 20 years later, war broke out again in Europe, World War II. And this time, Monnet, he was appointed to a special committee for reconciliation of the European states. They were looking towards the end of World War II and trying to ask the question, how are we going to solve this problem of war? In the space of 20 years, we've had 2 world wars on this continent. What are we going to do? And so he gave a speech at this committee, and this is what he declared. He said, there will be no peace in Europe if the states, referring to the countries of Europe, are reconstituted on the basis of what? National sovereignty. The countries of Europe are too small to guarantee the peoples the necessary prosperity and social development. The European states must constitute themselves into a federation. For Jean Monnet, the way to build a new union is through incremental steps towards economic integration that would one day lead to political integration. And that's exactly what Jean Monnet did. He led the French and the Germans together to establish what became known as the European Coal and Steel Community. And they started working together in this economic partnership. In 1961, Time magazine recognized Jean Monnet as the father of modern Europe, because through his visionary, he was able to build this strong partnership and alliance of states, which eventually, in 1993, became the European Union as we know it today. And that has just been growing and growing and growing as more and more countries have become member states. Now let's fast forward a little bit here. In 1999, January 1st, they introduced the Eurodollar, which most of us are very familiar with now, as that's the currency of Europe. But that was a revolutionary idea, to wipe out all of the single individual currencies and unite them with $1. However, within 10 years, cracks were starting to be seen in this new economic order in Europe. Between 2009 and 2011, there was massive bailouts to some of the smaller countries in the Eurozone. You remember for a period of time, you would see every single night something about the Euro crisis, the Eurozone crisis, the zone crisis. You'd see all this stuff over and over again every single night. Smaller countries like Greece, Ireland, and Portugal were being bailed out because of the adapting to a new currency. Unemployment was very high, incomes were very low, inflation was out of control, and there was massive sovereign debt causing problems. Later, in 2011 to 2012, the second phase shifted the crisis to the larger countries. We saw Italy and Spain getting involved. And as a result of this, the countries introduced very strong austerity measures upon its people, which basically meant they cut all spending and increased taxes. And if you remember the news just a few years ago, there was a massive backlash to these austerity measures, and there were protests in most of the European countries. Do you remember this? It was only just a few years ago. In 2015, there were talks that Greece was going to exit the European Union. And in 2015, a term, Brexit, was being used around financial communities. But that was avoided when a bailout was given, and they were able to stay in the Union. In 2010 to 2017, another crisis wave struck this European zone, and that was migration crisis. You remember seeing night after night in the news, there were boats after boats after boats of refugees coming from Northern Africa, from the Middle East, from Syria, and these various places. More than 1.4 million people arrived in the European zone, the European nation states there, putting massive pressure not just on the economy, but on integration, on religious conflict and tension. There was the fears of terrorism. It wasn't helping the dream of a united Europe. And then, most famously, as you would remember, in 2016, Britain decided they had enough, and they took a referendum, and the vote came back that they were going to leave the European Union. They called it Brexit. And to this day, they're still trying to get out. They've had to push the deadline. They're supposed to be out already, but they pushed it till October, just a few months from now. So many people in the world today, thinking men and women, positions of power and trust, they're asking themselves this question: what is happening with Europe? Will it remain united or will it divide? The problem with European history is every single time there has been sort of economic tension, it's normally resulted in a war. And so there are serious fears that we could be looking at another war in the European zone. Some say that's just fear-mongering. But I want to share with you something I have found that's remarkably interesting with these two events. We've seen that both of these two stages of development were connected to World War I and World War II. And there is one event that somewhat connects World War I and World War II together that's really eerie. And as we will explore now, this thing that ties these two events may hold the answers to some of the questions we want to ask through the course of this series. So let's start with World War I. You're getting a bit of a history lesson on your European ancestry today. World War I began with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. He was in Sarajevo. He was the crown prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was assassinated. The assassination obviously didn't go down too well. It was the crown prince after all. And so people started pointing fingers. Who did it? Who did it? They decided, and history seems to suggest, that it was blamed on a group of people from the Serbian state who were being oppressed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When that took place, so this is a map back in the 1900s, Austro-Hungarian Empire, here's the Serbian state. The Austro-Hungarian Empire went to Germany and said, Germany, if we go in against the Serbs, will you have our back? Germany said yes. And so the Austro-Hungarian Empire gave Serbia a list of demands, and they had 30 days to fulfill it. Most historians believe today it was completely unexpected they would ever reach the demands because they wanted war. So they didn't reach the demands. 30 days went by, and war was declared by the Austro-Hungarian Empire on Serbia. The problem with that is that Serbia had alliances with Russia. And so Russia said, you touch Serbia, we're in. That then brought Germany in. Germany said, well, you don't mess with the Austro-Hungarian Empire because we're in. Then the French jumped in on the side of Serbia and Russia, and the United Kingdom came in. And ultimately the United States came in as well. And so we have World War I. Now, even though this is the official sequence of events that triggered the start of World War I, most historians today believe that it was actually more to do with this guy, Kaiser Wilhelm II. He was the emperor of the German Empire at the time. In fact, he is in history now the last emperor of Germany. He was the grandson of Queen Victoria over in England. And he was raised most of his early years over there in England, but soon enough he started developing very fanatical ideas of nationalism, to the point when he came back to Germany, he started to desire this dream of having Germany as the most powerful nation in Europe. And so to accomplish that, he built the largest naval fleet in Europe and the biggest ground forces that any state had seen in that part of the world. And the scene was set. And most historians today believe that he was just itching for something to trigger all-out war where he could claim territory. And that happened to just coincide with the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Empire's crown prince, who was his ally, and the rest is history, as they say. But I mentioned that there is this one eerily similar connection between World War I and World War II. And here's where it starts. Even though Kaiser Wilhelm, he had the idea that he wanted to sort of join all of Europe under German rule, one day there's a cathedral in Metz in France, and as these troops were going past it, the troops noticed that, as all these cathedrals have, there's a series of images and statues around it. They noticed this statue, and this statue is of the prophet Daniel. Daniel being one of the books in this Bible. And they reported this statue back to Kaiser Wilhelm. And when he had heard that the prophet Daniel's statue was on this church, he got pretty upset, to say the least, to the point where he says this. He says, "Daniel's prophecy does not fit with my plans. I cannot accept that. Where Charlemagne and others have failed, I will succeed." There was something about this Daniel guy, this statue that's standing in front of a cathedral in France, that when Kaiser Wilhelm heard about it, he lost the plot. He's like, this guy, this Daniel, his prophecy, it doesn't fit with my plans. And he got so infuriated with it. I mean, watch this next statement. He sends a command. He says, "Remove Daniel's head and replace it with mine." What was it about this statue of this prophet Daniel, who is an author of one of the books in this Bible, that he had such a problem with that he said, "Get rid of its face and put my face on there"? What was it about this book? If you actually look at the image here, you can see it's different. Can you see the color disfiguration there? Because the face was changed at the command of Kaiser Wilhelm. What was it about Daniel, and what prophecy did Daniel predict that didn't fit in with Kaiser Wilhelm's plans? Well, we'll explore that in just a little bit. Let's jump now to World War II. You've all heard of this guy, Adolf Hitler. After World War I ended, it didn't end well, did it, for Kaiser Wilhelm and his plans. When World War I ended, the League of Nations got together and they redefined some of the boundaries in Europe. And they decided that a portion of Germany should be annexed from Germany and given to Poland. Now, when this guy came on the scene, Adolf Hitler, he said, that belongs to Germany. That portion of Poland belongs to Germany. So we're going to take it back. So they did. But they didn't stop there. They kept going, trying to take all of Europe. Now, Adolf Hitler, he predicted that under the rule of Nazis, there would be a 1,000-year domination of Europe. Now, we have the advantage, right, sitting back here in history, in the future, and looking back at history and going, well, that was a pretty bad prediction there, Adolf Hitler. Didn't work out. But in the day, this was his claim. And he said in March 1941, he said this in a speech. He said, "See, my people, we do not need anything from who? From God. We do not ask anything from Him except that He leaves us what? Alone." So in World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm, he said, listen, whatever Daniel's prophecy is, it doesn't fit in with my plans. In World War II, Adolf Hitler stands up and says, we don't want anything from God. We want God to leave us alone. Don't get involved. And then he says this, we want to fight our own war with our own guns without who? With God. We want to gain our victory without the help of who? God. Adolf Hitler was intent that there's something about God that he doesn't want anything him to be involved with. Adolf Hitler has plans. Kaiser Wilhelm had plans. They both had issues with this thing of God. Now, we have the advantage, as I said before, looking back in history, and we can see that Europe has had many people who have tried to unite it. But has it worked? No. So what was Kaiser Wilhelm and Hitler so worried about? Why didn't they want God involved in their plans? Why didn't they accept Daniel's prophecy? What was this Daniel's prophecy? What were they so worried about? I mean, think about this. The head of state is worried about this book. Kaiser Wilhelm, the largest military force in Europe at that point in time, and he's worried about this book. Why? What has the book got to say? They're all worried about, worried about Daniel. Daniel, who is this guy? Well, as I mentioned before, he is the author of one tiny little scroll, one little section of this book. It's only 12 chapters long. It's tiny in comparison to the whole book. He was a Hebrew, born in Jerusalem, and in his 12 chapters, 6 of those chapters deal with stories. The other 6 chapters deal with predictions. But the question is to be asked, what evidence is there that this book actually was written when it was written? Because here's the thing with prophecy. It's very easy to claim to have known the future after the event has happened. For example, I just know that you would love to be able to write out a lotto ticket with the winning numbers after the lotto has been drawn. Right? You would just love to do that because you know you got the 100% chance of being right. So some critics say, well, the book of Daniel, what's to say it wasn't written after the prophecies? The Bible claims that this book was written somewhere around the period of 600 BC. So that's 2,600 years from today. There are 3 pieces of evidence that establish that this book was written when it was claimed to have been written. The first piece of evidence is the Dead Sea Scrolls. You heard the Dead Sea Scrolls, everybody? Have you heard of them? In 1947, there was a little boy. He was taking care of some goats, and one of them got lost. And so he's running around trying to find them, and he finds some caves. He gets a little rock. He throws it up into the cave to try and get the goat to come out, and instead he hears shattering pottery, it turned out to be. He goes to get his dad. His dad comes up. The uncles come up. They go into the cave, and they find what we now call today the Dead Sea Scrolls. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of scrolls and fragments of scrolls of the Old Testament. Well, when you look at these scrolls, a lot of them are written on animal skin. And the great thing with animal skin is that you can carbon date it. And when you carbon date it, we have found that most of those scrolls, especially the portions with Daniel on, have been dated back to at least 150 to 200 BC. So that means that the book of Daniel had to have been written at least before 200 BC. Does that make sense? It can't be written after 200 BC because it was already written before 200 BC. Does that make sense? A second piece of evidence is a guy called Josephus. He's a famous historian. And he writes, he's a Jewish historian, and he writes that when Alexander the Great, what year did Alexander the Great reign? Do you remember? Which century? Oh, you're doing very well. 331 BC was when Alexander the Great established the Greek Empire. And in 331, when he's invading the Jewish regions, Josephus has an account that puts rabbis carrying the scroll of Daniel to Alexander the Great. So that means that that book of Daniel had to exist when? At least in 331 BC. Are you following with me? But if it was given to him then, it had to have been written before then. And the third piece of evidence is Aramaic. Aramaic is one of the languages of the Bible. It's very similar to Hebrew. And careful historians have established that the writing style, if you look at the writing style 100 years ago in English, you will see that there's a particular way that letters were written. I've read my grandmother's letters, and it's not the way I write. Is it the way you write? Maybe you do. I don't know. But the way we write our letters today, it changes over periods of time, and we can establish roughly into even what decade writing has been done based on the style of writing. And so historians have established that the Aramaic that Daniel's scroll has been written on is consistent with the writing of the 600 BC or the 6th century BC. So we have 3 pieces of evidence that the book of Daniel is in fact written at the time when it claims to have been written. So that means that as we read the predictions in the book, they were predicted before any of the events that the book predicts. Does that make sense? So what's the actual story in the book of Daniel? The story starts with a Babylonian captivity. Babylon was a nation to its east of Jerusalem and Israel, and the king over there called Nebuchadnezzar, he marches over into Jerusalem and he takes a bunch of the people there captive. He surrounds the city and conquers the city, but he takes a bunch of them captive and marches them back to Babylon. Daniel starts with the story of some of these young people who have been taken captive being led into the gates of Babylon and being taken and trained as future wise people and counselors of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. It was a great strategy because if you can take the young people as captive from your enemy states, train them up into your way of thinking, your way of politics, all those sorts of things, then you can send them back and they can be good ambassadors for you. That was the plan. Now, chapter 2, the next book, introduces a story about a dream. And this is specifically the part that Kaiser Wilhelm was referring to when he said that Daniel's prophecy does not fit what? Into my plan, or does not fit with my plans. This is the chapter he was referring to. In this chapter, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. He wakes up from the dream. He can't remember what the dream is. He calls the wise men. And remember in chapter 1, Daniel, he had a couple of friends. They were included in this group of wise men. But for whatever reason, the story says that they weren't called. They only called the local people in town, the Babylonians and the Chaldeans and these various other guys. So when they come and they tell the story, Nebuchadnezzar tells them the story of these, had the dream, can't remember it. You tell me what I dreamt and what it meant. I want to ask you a question. How many of you have had a dream before? Every one of you, right? How many of you have woken up and gone, man, I don't know what that dream is supposed to mean? That happens to me often. Some cultures are very in tune with dreams. They see great meaning in the dream and they think they can understand, well, if you dreamt about bread, somehow that's to do with prosperity. If it's about teeth, it's something to do with pain. There's all these different symbols you can encode things with. And in the Babylonians, they were very, very in tune with the idea that dreams equaled something. And so there was a real art of these wise men to interpret dreams. In fact, in archaeology, they have they found these livers of cattle that have been sculpted into clay. So they get a liver, they sculpt it, and they've got all these meticulous little lines and meridians carved into these animal livers, and each area represents something according to the dream. So what would happen is you'd have a dream, they go sacrifice an animal, they pull out the liver, and they'd compare it to these clay ones, and they'd go, oh boy, king, not a good dream. Or, oh, it was a good dream, king. So they'd make it up as they go, right? Now, I've had many dreams that I haven't known the answer to, but I tell you what, I've never met a single person that if you tell me your dream, I can't tell you what it means. I do it all the time. Jokingly, of course, but it works every single time. You can tell me your dream from last night. I can give you the interpretation. That's how good I am. You might have had a dream about flying. I tell you what, watch out because you might be dying soon. You have a good dream about gardening. Oh, watch out. You might be fertilizer soon. It doesn't matter what your dream is about. I can give you an interpretation. Are you following? Yes or no? So these guys, they weren't actually that switched on. They were just good storytellers. So Nebuchadnezzar, he's like, I want you to tell me what I dreamt. Now that's a bit harder, isn't it? You know, if one of you came to me and said, hey, can you tell me what I dreamt last night? I'd go, no, not a chance. But if you tell me what you dreamt, I can tell you what it means. It's a good deal. So obviously the king, he gets cluey to this. In Daniel chapter 2, he says this. He says, oh, I see what you're trying to do. You're trying to buy time from me because you see that the dream, I can't remember it. So these guys, they say this. You tell us the dream, we'll tell you the interpretation. He says, I don't remember the dream. So here's what's going to happen. You've got one day. You give me the dream and its interpretation, or you're dead. This king was probably a bit bipolar. In some scenes, he's very happy. In other scenes, he wants people dead. And he actually says, I want you dead. I want your house burnt. I want everything. Like, yeah. So they can't do it. A death decree is given. All the wise men dead. Now they go get Daniel and say, Daniel, you're a wise man. You're going to get executed. Daniel says, wait. What for? Why am I getting executed? So they tell him the story. So he says, let me go see the king. He goes to the king. He says, King, I can give you the dream and the interpretation if you give me time, because I'll pray to my God in heaven, not your gods, but my God in heaven, and he will come through. So the king wanted them dead because they were messing around with him. But he actually wants what? He wants the answer. So Daniel goes away. They praise with their friends. He goes to sleep. And in that, I don't know if it was a peaceful sleep, but in that sleep, he received a dream. And Daniel chapter 2 tells us that dream. So while he is sleeping, the answer comes. And if you have a Bible, if you've got one there, I'd invite you just to open it to Daniel chapter 2. And we're going to explore the answer here to the dream, or the prayer and what the dream was. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 24, Daniel chapter 2. And in verse 24, this is what the Bible says. So this is Daniel. He says, Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. And he went to him and said, Thus, do not destroy the wise men. I will tell the king the interpretation. Now, if you jump down in your passage there to verse 26, it says, The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its what? Its interpretation. Verse 27, Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers, cannot they declare to the king? This is kind of a little bit cheeky, I think. Daniel's got the answer. He's received the dream. He knows what it means. He's holding it in his mind here. He's before the king, and the king says, Well, can you do it? And he says, Well, wait. Before I tell you what it is, can't you ask all of your wise men, all of your astrologers, all of the soothsayers? Can't you do that? What's the answer? Of course not. He's already tried. Daniel here is showing that he is confident that his God is the only God. Notice what happens next. In verse 28, There is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the what? Latter days. That means in the future. I want you to notice this. King Nebuchadnezzar was not a good guy. He went into these countries and he invaded, he killed, he conquered, he did all sorts of crazy stuff. And yet who spoke to him? The Bible said God spoke to him. God doesn't look at you as going, You are so evil, you're so bad, I can't talk to you. In fact, God wants to talk to you. And so the king here, despite all of who he is, God has chosen to speak to him through this dream. Now, notice what it says in verse 29. As for you, O king, thoughts came on your mind while you were on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who has revealed secrets has made known to you what will be. Again, we're being set up here that before Daniel explains the dream is about the future. Verse 30. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have any more what? Wisdom than any living, but for our sakes who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. So Daniel's saying, listen, I'm going to tell you what the dream's about. Don't worry. I've got it. God's shown it to me. But what I'm sharing with you is not because I'm any better than anybody else. I'm sharing this with you because God wants you to know. So notice what happens now. Verse 31. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image, this great image whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. We've got a picture of the image over here. If you look over here, this is essentially an artist's representation of what this dream was about. If you notice the next part, it says in verse 32, the image's head was of fine gold, his chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of, its feet partly of iron and clay. And you watched while a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke it into pieces. That's the dream. Daniel says, you saw this image, king. That's what you saw. Now, you can imagine, the king is like, if you came to me and said, hey, tell me what I dreamt last night, and I told you, you're going to be, whoa, how did you know? Now, that's impressive, but what was the whole point of this conversation with the king anyway? He wants to know the interpretation. So Daniel tells him, here's what you saw. You saw a golden head, a silver chest, a bronze and iron legs and iron and clay, and you saw a rock come down and dash it into pieces. That's what you saw. But now, notice this. In verse 36, this is the dream. Now we will tell you the what? Interpretation of it before the king. I like how Daniel does this. He says, we will tell you. Who's we? It's God. Daniel's a mouthpiece for the message here. Now remember, Kaiser Wilhelm, most powerful man in Europe at the point in time, some would argue. He's got military at his disposal. He's got the navy at his disposal. He's got land troops at his disposal. And yet he says, I hate the idea that some guy called Daniel has a prophecy that's going opposite to where I'm going. Get rid of his head. Something about this guy, Daniel. So what's the interpretation? Daniel says this, there is a God in heaven who reveals the secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. So we know already this image is going to tell us something about the future. So let's have a look. In Daniel 2 verse 38, he says, you are this head of gold. So if we look at this head here over here in our image, that head represents Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, Babylon, the Great. And we know from history that Babylon was established roughly in 605 BC, and it ran all the way to 538. Daniel says, God is showing you a future from your point to some other point. And it's starting with you. You're the golden head. Now, I could imagine that if you were the king there, you're looking at the image that he's describing to you, you're like, yeah, baby, I'm the head. The head's what controls the body. The head's the brain, right? And by the way, it's made of gold. Gold's a whole lot more valuable than clay, isn't it? So yeah, I like the sounds of that. Daniel sounds pretty good. The only problem is that the head of gold ends at the neck, which means that Babylon must come to an end. And that's exactly what happened. Babylon fell to a guy called Cyrus. And Cyrus was a cunning military strategist. You see, Babylon was built with a massive wall that surrounded and protected it, as most cities did in those days. But up the middle of that city was the great river Euphrates. And on either side, as the river came in through the city and came out through the city, there were great iron gates that went down into the water to ensure that nothing could go, like no boat craft could go down the river and creep on into the city. But Cyrus thought, what if there's no water in the river? Or we could drop the water level down. We could just walk right under those bars. And that's exactly what he did. They had the river diverted upstream, and in the same night, just so happens, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, who was king of Babylon, is throwing a great feast. And he basically insults the God of Israel by taking some of the treasure that came from the temple that his grandfather conquered. And he goes and pours wine into it, which was never meant to happen. And Babylon fell that very night, with King Cyrus taking the throne, marking the start of the next empire, the Medo-Persians. Medo-Persians took on the Babylonian district and community in 538. And that silver, if you know your metals, which one's harder, silver or gold? Obviously silver. But which one's more valuable? Gold. So something in value is decreasing in this image, but the strength has increased. So Medo-Persia comes in. And Medo-Persia has a period of rule. But the text only simply says another kingdom inferior to yours will come on. But then it goes on and says in the next verse, it says, then a third kingdom of bronze will come. The vision that Nebuchadnezzar was given, that dream, wasn't so much about all the details of each of the kingdoms. It was to show the succession of the kingdoms. So we know from history that Medo-Persia comes and conquers Babylon. But we also know that it won't last forever because another kingdom of bronze would come. And that's exactly what happened. Medo-Persia fell to Alexander the Great in 331 BC. And that's not where the prophecy ends either. The next verse says, and the fourth kingdom shall come. Notice we're not getting much information here, are we? We know that the head is who? The king, Babylon, and then we said, and after you there's another one, and after that one there's another one, but we're not told a whole lot of details. But from history, looking back, we see Babylon fell to a kingdom, that kingdom, Medo-Persia, that fell to a kingdom, Greece. But then it says this in verse 40, it says, and the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. The fourth kingdom that conquered Greece was Rome. Every person who's been through any basic European history knows this stuff. Even I, who hated history in school. It's funny that I present this stuff because I hated history in school. I remember I had to do an assignment on Pharaoh. I was like, I hate Egyptian history. And yet it's interesting because when you know the past, it helps navigate you through the future. And so Rome, it rose up there in 168, it conquers Babylon there, and it becomes the fourth empire, Imperial Rome. Now, remember the succession? It says, you are the golden head. So Babylon starts the head, but then it says, another will come, another will come, another will come. We've got 4 kingdoms now, haven't we? I want you to notice what the text says next. It says, the kingdom shall be what? Divided. Notice it doesn't say there will be what's the pattern been so far? Another kingdom, another kingdom. No. When you get to the fourth kingdom, there's not going to be another. It's going to be the fourth is divided. That's very specific. So if we're going to take Daniel's prophecy and look at the history of the world, we should be able to go, okay, so what came after Babylon? Well, we know that, and that was Medo-Persia. What came after Medo-Persia? Well, we know that. That was Greece. What came after Greece, everybody? Imperial Rome. All right. And what came after that? One of the greatest mysteries of the Roman Empire is that it didn't get conquered. It fell from inside. it divided from inside, exactly as the prophecy predicted. If you know your Roman history, it took a few years for this to happen, but by 476, the Roman Empire had completely crumbled from being one super empire into 10 barbaric tribes. Those 10 tribes over time, they mingled and changed, and you ended up with 3 of them being removed, which we'll explore in another presentation. But exactly as the prophecy predicted in Daniel's point in time, history shows that's exactly what happened. So notice this now. Verse 43. As you saw iron mixed with clay, so we're down here in the feet now, right? So we've got our iron legs there, that's Rome. And now we haven't got another kingdom because iron is still in the feet. What's the feet made of? Iron and clay. So there's iron still there, that's the remnants of Rome. But we've got an addition now, clay. So it says here, as you saw iron mixed with clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere one to another, just as iron is mixed with clay. I've done a bit of chemistry. I'm not a chemist. I've done a bit. And I've done enough to know that you can't get iron and clay and mix it together into a compound. Doesn't work. And yet the prophet is saying, that's the imagery you're going to get down here in the feet. So what did this represent? As I alluded to already from history, 476, when Rome collapsed and divided, it formed what we call today Europe. And so that feet there represent divided Europe from 476 AD, to our present time. So here's the remarkable thing with Daniel's prophecy. 2,600 years of future are given in 140 words. The king gets a dream, it's 140 words long. But in that dream, Daniel claims, who God gave, he can tell here's the next 2,600 years in terms of big picture succession of power. Does that make sense? Absolutely remarkable. So when you consider this, we're either looking at, this is one of the most amazing hoax, this story, Daniel chapter 2, or we're actually dealing with something supernatural. That's your two options, isn't it? Either it's just a hoax or a coincidence at best that there was actually from Babylon a succession of 4 empires and the 4th one happened to divide. That was either a great guess, it's a hoax, meaning it's, because Daniel claims very specifically this comes from who? From God. So either it does or it doesn't. Now I have to admit, when I first heard this story, I was 23 years old. I was very, very skeptical. The idea that 2,600 years of prophecy could be foretold 2,600 years ago in 140 words, that's pretty remarkable. Either it is or it isn't. Kaiser Wilhelm, remember what he said? Daniel's prophecy. What's the prophecy? No matter how hard you try, as iron and clay do not mix together naturally, no matter how hard you try, you will not be able to unite Europe. Kaiser Wilhelm II. Daniel's prophecy does not fit with my plans. What's his plan? He wants to unite Europe. I cannot accept that, he says. What would it matter if this was just a story? If this is just a story, who cares what Daniel prophesied? Right? Do it anyway, Kaiser Wilhelm. Go make your united Europe. It's only a book. But history tells us that it didn't accomplish what he was trying to do. And Daniel's prophecy seems to have overruled Kaiser Wilhelm's plans. If we look at this prophecy, there are 7 predictive elements. The first was that Babylon was the starting point. The second predictive element was that a second empire would come and conquer Babylon, Medo-Persia. The third is that Greece would come. The fourth is that Rome would come. The fifth is that Rome would divide. Sixth is that it wouldn't unite. And the seventh is a great rock would come and destroy the whole thing to pieces. But the rock would come at the time of the feet, the seventh. All theologians unanimously agree that that rock represents the second coming of Jesus, or the establishment of God's kingdom, because this is an image of kingdoms. And so if we look at this statistically, here's our 7 predictive elements. Number 1, it fulfilled. Number 2, that fulfilled. Number 3, fulfilled. Number 4, fulfilled. Number 5, fulfilled. Number 6, fulfilled. We are living in a time of divided Europe, are we not? There's one element left in this prophecy, and that is the establishment of God's kingdom. I'd like to propose to you, if you are a gambler, I'll come and help you get rid of your gambling problem. But if you are a gambler or a betting person, if you looked at the odds, there are 7 bets to place, and so far 6 have been fulfilled exactly in the sequence they were predicted. What do you think the probability is that the last one will be fulfilled as well? You're processing the numbers, aren't you? At 23 years of age, when I looked at this and I understood that this is still waiting to be fulfilled, I said, man, I'm all right with mathematics. I'm not super amazing with it, but I'm all right. I'm a programmer. When I look at this, what comes to mind is, it's a sure bet. Are you following me? I know you're not gamblers, so you don't get the terminology. A sure bet means I can put everything on this and I'm pretty sure I'm going to win. And so when I looked at this prophecy at 23 years of age, I said, you know what? I reckon I'm in. I think there's enough here. Kaiser Wilhelm wasn't a dumb guy. And he saw, I don't like this. He tried to fight it. Where's he now? Adolf Hitler comes along and says, we don't want God interfering with our plans. Where's he now? I don't claim to have any of the power or intelligence of those individuals. It's probably a good thing, to be honest. But I tell you, when I look at the pattern, I think we're looking at something pretty supernatural. When Nebuchadnezzar heard all of this, it says, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. Then the king answered Daniel and said, truly, your God is a God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. I put it to you again. Either this is a hoax, or it's dealing with something that's supernatural. Our lives today are often categorized by uncertainty. Is that true? It's uncertain whether we will see our loved ones live to a certain age, uncertain whether the economy is going to keep going this way or go that way, interest rates, our life is categorized with uncertainty. But there's one thing that this prophecy did for me personally. If there is a God, because remember, it claims that I will tell you the future and that's how you will know that I am the only God. If that's true, and if He knows the meticulous order of human kingdoms, if He knows history, then He must also know my history. If He knows the future, He must also know my future. I put it to you this morning that if this thing works out to be true, that we are dealing with a supernatural book with a supernatural author, that brings a sense of certainty that I never had as an atheist.